Look me in the eyes and answer this. What would you do if you saw your faith shaking hands with evil? This story isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented, but buried. And after this, you may never look at the church, or the world, the same way again. If stories like this make you think, question, and dig deeper, subscribe to the channel now. This is just the beginning. It was a stifling morning in Rome, in the summer of 1933. Church bells rang out as they did on any other day, but in that corner of the Vatican, an unsettling silence prevailed. It wasn't the reverent hush of prayer, it was something else. A silence that precedes a decision destined to echo for decades. A diplomatic silence. Calculated. Almost embarrassed. On that morning of July 20th, two men met on behalf of their worlds. On one side stood Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the Vatican's Secretary of State, his expression solemn, his gaze unwavering, and the subtlety of a man well acquainted with the corridors of power. On the other, Franz von Papen, Vice-Chancellor of Germany, clad in the dark elegance of the new Nazi regime. Neither man smiled. And when their hands met to seal the agreement, no sacred words were spoken, no mention of peace, only the cold finality of a pact signed in the name of order. Outside, no one heard the details. But the impact would ripple like waves. In Germany, crowds gathered in public squares. Books burned in piles outside libraries. Hitler's face was plastered on posters beside nationalist slogans. Youth were trained to obey, not to think. And Jews began to vanish from sidewalks, from universities, from the lives of their neighbors. A new world was being born, and it thrived on blind obedience. Why, then, did the Vatican reach out its hand? That's the question many are still afraid to ask. For centuries, the Church had confronted empires, kings, and revolutions. It had been persecuted, celebrated, divided, and rebuilt. But now, in the face of a regime rooted in intolerance, racial idolatry, and absolute authoritarianism, it hesitated. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps calculation. Perhaps faith in the power of dialogue to contain evil. Or perhaps, simply, the old temptation to preserve the institution, even when that meant sacrificing the prophetic voice. This video is about that moment. Not to condemn with arrogance, nor to absolve with naivety, but to look directly into one of the darkest episodes in the history of the Christian faith, and not flinch. Because some facts were buried. Documents sealed. Names forgotten. But the truth, the real truth, has a strange way of resurfacing. And what you're about to hear may forever change the way you see modern Christianity, the history of the 20th century, and maybe even your own faith. The year was 1918. The trenches were soaked in mud, corpses, and despair. World War I had claimed over 16 million lives. But it wasn't just the geography of Europe that was torn apart, it was the soul of Christian civilization. Priests heard confessions under artillery fire. Chaplains died clutching the wounded. Entire churches were turned into field hospitals, where the sound of bells was replaced by the screams of the mutilated. The gospel was read with trembling hands. The Eucharist was consecrated in ration tins. And soldiers, many of them still teenagers, died clutching crucifixes between their fingers. And when the blood stopped flowing, the emptiness set in. Millions returned home with living bodies but dead faith. A question lingered in the air like poison gas. Where was God in Verdun? Where was God in Ypres, in the Somme, in Passchendaele? Sermons no longer had answers. Homilies sounded hollow. The world was disillusioned, with kings, with armies, and with the Church. In Catholic countries like France, Italy, and Austria, ecclesiastical prestige quickly withered. Secularism was on the rise. Intellectuals preached the death of religion. Pews stood empty. The Pope's authority, once enough to shake empires, was now seen by many as irrelevant in the face of modern times. But the wound ran even deeper in Germany. There, the Catholic Church was a minority surrounded by a Protestant majority. And even that minority was divided, torn between loyalty to Rome and allegiance to German nationalism. The Center Party, which represented Catholics in politics, came under fire. And the fear of communism, spreading from Bolshevik Russia, made the atmosphere even more volatile. It was on this landscape of moral ruin that the Vatican saw a greater danger: the risk of disappearing, of losing its voice, its influence, its place in the rebuilding of the world. And so the search for allies began. Anyone who promised to fight Marxist atheism, restore traditional order, and show at least minimal respect for the Church's structure, was heard with interest. Even an extremist party, born in the beer halls of Munich, led by a former Austrian soldier with a peculiar mustache and a fiery gaze. Adolf Hitler. He was still a rising name. But he already presented himself as a man of providence, a restorer of morals, a defender of the family and of national Christianity. A seductive message to frightened ears. The question echoing through the corridors of the Vatican wasn't, can he be trusted? But rather, can he be useful? Berlin, 1930. The streets were boiling over. Mass unemployment. Barefoot children selling cigarettes in train stations. Mothers weeping outside shuttered bakeries. The German mark had lost so much value that it was cheaper to burn money than to buy firewood. The Weimar Republic was staggering. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, drained of hope, and drowning in debt, was searching for a savior. And when a people desperately seek a savior, they end up accepting any messiah. Adolf Hitler didn't appear out of nowhere. He was the product of a collapsing era. A former World War I soldier, a hypnotic speaker, a defender of pan-Germanism, and a declared enemy of Marxism, Hitler embodied the resentment of a generation. He promised greatness, national pride, discipline, and above all, order. And beneath his fiery rhetoric, there was a subtext that seduced many Catholics: rejection of atheist communism, defense of the traditional family, promotion of patriotic values, opposition to cultural liberalism. The rhetoric was captivating. The aesthetics, powerful. His rallies felt like inverted liturgies, flags, anthems, symbols, oaths. And many Christians, confused and afraid, began to see in that inverted cross, the swastika, a twisted form of hope. But the Vatican was watching with different eyes. To the Holy See, the greater threat was the spread of Bolshevism. In 1917, the Russian Revolution had established an officially atheist regime. Churches were burned, priests were executed, religious icons destroyed. Russia had become the symbol of the end of Christendom. That was what Pacelli, then apostolic nuncio in Bavaria, watched with horror. And that was what he swore to fight with all the power of Vatican diplomacy. So when Hitler appeared as the #1 enemy of communism, the Vatican took notice. In 1933, Hitler took office as chancellor. And in less than 6 months, he turned Germany into a totalitarian state. Political parties were dissolved. The press was silenced. Labor unions were swallowed up. And the youth were mobilized. But he still needed one thing: international respect. And that would come from a single signature, the Vatican's. A treaty with the Catholic Church would serve as a crown of legitimacy before the world. It would show that the new regime respected faith, traditional values, moral order. And Pacelli saw an opportunity. A chance to protect the rights of the Church, its schools, its seminaries, its dioceses, even if the cost was neutrality in the face of a rising regime. Hitler, in turn, made impossible promises. And the Vatican, having negotiated with emperors and fascists before, saw nothing unusual in doing so again. But something was different. Something darker. Something that was already palpable even before the war. A cult of the leader that suppressed the worship of God. A perversion of Christianity that replaced the cross of Christ with the symbol of racial purity. The Church stood before a brutal dilemma: to confront the new regime and lose influence? Or to negotiate with it and protect the institution, even at the risk of betraying its prophetic mission? And so the outlines of the pact began to take shape. Signed with golden pens, but written in silence and fear. July 20, 1933. The ink was still fresh on the diplomatic parchment that sealed one of the most controversial agreements in modern church history. The Reichskonkordat was signed with formality, but without celebration. It was a pact of survival disguised as diplomacy, a treaty that promised to protect the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany, while offering the Nazi regime a level of respectability it could never have achieved on its own. On one side, the Vatican sought concrete guarantees: freedom of worship, recognition of religious orders, autonomy for Catholic schools, the right to appoint bishops, diplomatic immunity. On the other side, Hitler wanted only one thing: legitimacy. With the Vatican's signature, the Catholic world, especially the millions of faithful in Germany and Austria, would receive the message. The new government was acceptable, negotiable, respectable. It was a triumph for Nazi propaganda. Regime newspapers ran triumphant headlines: Germany and Rome united for religious peace. Photographs of representatives in clerical robes and military uniforms painted a chilling image: spiritual power sealing a deal with totalitarian rule. Behind the scenes, the architect of the agreement on the Vatican side was Eugenio Pacelli, who would become Pope Pius XII just a few years later. A cold diplomat and skilled strategist, Pacelli believed the pact with Hitler was a necessary evil to contain communism. His fear of atheistic Marxism ran so deep that he preferred to gamble on a deal with Nazism than risk seeing the church extinguished in Germany if the communists rose to power. Hitler, meanwhile, never intended to honor the treaty. In private, he mocked the agreement and the priests who dared to trust him. He was once quoted as saying, "I'll put an end to this idiotic Catholicism." But slowly, carefully, like peeling off a skin, and he began immediately. Just months after the Reichskonkordat was signed, Hitler dissolved the Center Party, the last political bastion of Catholic resistance in the Reichstag. With that, he wiped out any form of legal opposition in parliament. The church lost a vital arm, its direct political influence. Then came the systematic violations of the treaty. Priests were monitored by the Gestapo, Catholic schools were pressured or shut down, religious publications were censored, Catholic youth groups were dismantled and absorbed into the Hitler Youth, nuns and monks were accused of immorality. To discredit their orders, did the Vatican respond? Yes, but in silence. Diplomatic letters were sent. Formal protests filed. Internal notes circulated. But nothing made it to the pulpits. Nothing stirred the hearts of the faithful. The church was trapped in a labyrinth it had helped to design. It had wagered everything on institutional protection, and now, it could no longer raise its prophetic voice. The encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, which would come years later, was an attempt to break the silence. But it was too late. The Reichskonkordat not only failed as a tool of protection, it became a weapon of propaganda. The Nazi regime pointed to the treaty and said, "We stand with Rome. We are not enemies of the faith." It was a lie. But a lie made to look like truth by silence. Silence can be a gesture of wisdom. But sometimes, it screams louder than 1,000 words. After the signing of the Reichskonkordat, the first signs of betrayal came quickly, and they came heavy. Catholic schools, which were supposed to be protected by the treaty, began to be systematically suffocated. Religious teachers were replaced by agents of the regime. Catholic students were forced to sing Nazi anthems and salute the Führer before any prayer. The Catholic youth was forcibly dissolved. In its place came the Hitler Youth, with its military discipline, its cult of race, and its absolute loyalty to the Führer, occupying the space once filled by spiritual formation. Nuns and monks came under surveillance. Some were falsely accused of abuse, not in a pursuit of justice, but to destroy their credibility in the public eye. Priests who preached against Nazi ideology were followed, arrested, and some sent to concentration camps. One of them, parish priest Johannes Prasek, once preached against the regime, saying, "We cannot serve two masters. Either we follow Christ, or we follow Caesar." He was executed in 1943. And in the face of all this, the Vatican hesitated. Diplomats from the Holy See drafted formal protests, sent notes to embassies, requested private meetings with Reich leaders. But to the people, the ordinary faithful, the confused Catholics sitting in German churches, nothing was said clearly. The omission became a scandal. And the scandal turned into complicity. Not because the church wanted to support Nazism, but because, in protecting its structure, its privileges, its temples, it left the gospel at the margins. That hesitation reached a breaking point in 1937, when Pope Pius XI decided to act. That was when the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern, was born. Unlike other papal documents, it wasn't written in Latin but in German, a bold and symbolic move. The encyclical denounced the regime's lies, the violations of the treaty, and the cult of Hitler as a false messiah. It was, without a doubt, the Vatican's most courageous act up to that point. It was secretly printed and distributed to be read, on the same Sunday, in hundreds of churches across Germany. And so it was. The faithful listened, stunned. Some cried. Others stood and applauded. But the regime responded with fury. Printing presses were raided. Priests were arrested. Churches were treated as centers of resistance. The Vatican itself was threatened with a complete severing of diplomatic ties. And what could have been the beginning of a spiritual resistance became a final flame that soon went out. Because shortly afterward, Pius XI died. And he was replaced by none other than Eugenio Pacelli, the diplomat who had signed the Reichskonkordat. Now as Pius XII, he chose a strategy of calculated silence. For many, he worked behind the scenes, trying to protect Jews through indirect means. For others, his silence in the face of the Holocaust was unforgivable. During the darkest years of the war, when trains crossed Europe carrying lives to the death camps, the eyes of the world turned to Rome. A cry was expected. A condemnation. A word. But what was heard was the echo of silence. While the upper ranks of the church hesitated between diplomacy and silence, another church, invisible, vulnerable, and courageous, was beginning to rise, even knowing the price would be their very lives. This church wasn't found in the gilded halls of the Vatican, but in surveilled confessionals, in parish basements, in the frozen cells of concentration camps. They were priests, nuns, and bishops who made no deals. Who refused neutrality. Who, standing before the abyss, chose the cross. The first name many remember is Bernhard Lichtenberg, vicar of Berlin's cathedral. Every night, after the final Mass, he offered a public prayer for the deported Jews. "Pray with me for our brothers being sent to the East," he would say, looking directly into the eyes of his congregation. Everyone knew what that meant. He was breaking the pact of silence. He was arrested, tortured, and died en route to Dachau, with a rosary still in his hands. Another was Father Alfred Delp, a Jesuit involved in the Chryso Circle, a resistance group. He wrote about human dignity and Christian freedom, knowing full well the Gestapo was closing in. He was imprisoned, tortured, and before his execution, he wrote, "Christ did not die for the church to remain silent in the face of evil." In hidden convents, nuns forged birth certificates to save Jewish children. Some even hid newborns beneath their habits, disguised as illegitimate children of missing mothers. How many were arrested? How many vanished into the trains? Almost no one knows. In Austria, the Catholic farmer Franz Jägerstätter refused to swear loyalty to Hitler. Alone, without support from the local clergy, without the blessing of his diocese, he said, "I cannot be both a Christian and a Nazi." He was beheaded in 1943. Decades later, he would be beatified. But perhaps the most heartbreaking symbol of this Christian resistance is found in Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. There, one section was set apart, the priests' block. More than 2,700 clergy were imprisoned there. The vast majority were Catholic. Those who survived bore witness to scenes of indestructible faith. Masses secretly celebrated with crumbs of bread, rosaries crafted from scraps of wire, confessions whispered between wooden bunks, baptisms improvised with tears and melted snow. There, the gospel wasn't preached. It was lived. They were fragile men, starving, sick, broken in body. But their souls were unshakable. Because while the world bowed to power, they bowed only to the crucified. And the most tragic part? Most of them died without ever being publicly acknowledged by the Church's own leadership. They were forgotten, silenced, seen as inconvenient, because their lives shouted an uncomfortable truth. It was possible to have been prophetic. It was possible to have said no. It was possible to have died for truth, instead of negotiating with lies. These burned voices, in the camps, in the cells, in the trenches of conscience, are the side of history we almost never hear. But it is they who keep alive the hope that Christianity, though wounded, can still rise again. The Third Reich fell in 1945, crushed by the Allied forces, consumed by its own monstrosity. The camps were opened. The mass graves unearthed. Cameras captured horrors that seemed impossible. The world, at last, saw, and once again, it fell silent. But this time, from horror. And the Vatican? The Vatican emerged from the war with its walls intact, but with its moral authority deeply shaken. The war had ended, but another battle was just beginning, the battle for memory. In the decades that followed, documents began to surface, testimonies, photographs, letters. And a question grew like a shadow through the corridors of history. What did the Church do, and what did it fail to do? Some argued that Pope Pius XII acted behind the scenes. That he organized escape routes. That he protected Jews with forged documents. That he used the diplomacy of silence to save lives that spoken words might have condemned. Others, however, saw in his silence an unforgivable sin. How could one remain silent in the face of the Holocaust? How could one not cry out while millions were dying? How could one uphold a neutrality that bordered on complicity? In 1998, under international pressure and the cries of the faithful themselves, the Vatican published the document, We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah. It was an important gesture. The text acknowledged that many Christians had failed to oppose Nazism. It asked for forgiveness. It reaffirmed solidarity with the Jewish people. But it made no mention of the Reichskonkordat. No reference to Pius XII. No details about the quiet decisions that echoed in the hell of Auschwitz. What it lacked was courage. What it lacked was full truth. The Church that teaches repentance and confession hesitated to make its own confession before the world. And that left a deep scar, not just in the history of faith, but in the collective soul of humanity. Today, nearly a century later, the Vatican's secret archives from that period are still being opened, studied, deciphered. Historians continue to search for answers. But perhaps the greatest answer isn't found in the documents, but in the heart of every believer. Because this story is not just about the past. It speaks to the present. It speaks to every moment when faith bows to power. To every time Christianity is wielded as a political shield. To every silence that becomes more comfortable than the cross. The dark legacy of the Reichskonkordat is not just a treaty. It's a mirror. And it still asks us, even today, when truth comes at a cost, whose side are you on? Maybe that is the true penance, not to forget, not to romanticize, not to justify, but to remember and change. Because the Christ who was silent before Pilate was not complicit. He was the Lamb. But silence that makes pacts with evil is not sacred. It is cowardice. And that difference changes everything. If this story stirred something within you, discomfort, pain, or hope, don't ignore it. Share this video. Leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel now. Because as long as there is memory, there is a chance for redemption. And as long as there is faith, there is a chance to begin again.